He was standing at my kitchen table, going through my folders, when I walked in with the RCMP officer and my solicitor. I still remember the way his hands froze mid-air, the way he slowly turned around, and the way the colour drained from his face the moment he realised what was happening. 3 months. That's how long I'd been watching, waiting, collecting every piece of evidence I needed. He thought I was just a tired old woman who didn't understand her own finances. He was wrong. My name is Vivian. I'm 67 years old. I live in Oakville, Ontario, and I raised my daughter Simone by myself after her father passed away from a heart attack when she was 11. It was just the two of us for a long time, me working as an administrative coordinator at a law firm downtown, her doing her homework at the kitchen table while I made dinner. We were close, not just mother and daughter close. Friends, the kind of close where she'd call me from the grocery store to ask if I thought the peaches looked good. So when Simone told me she'd met someone, I was genuinely happy for her. She was 34. She'd had her heart broken before, and watching her smile the way she did when she talked about him, that was enough for me. His name was Conrad. He was 41, tall, had a kind of easy charm that made you feel immediately at ease. He worked in commercial real estate, drove a nice truck, always brought wine when he came to dinner. He called me Vivian right from the start, never Mrs. Hartley, which I thought was either confident or presumptuous. I chose to see it as confident. They got married 14 months after they met. Small ceremony at the Niagara-on-the-Lake winery where they'd had their first date. I wore a blue dress and I cried, and I meant every tear. The first year was fine. Conrad and Simone bought a semi-detached in Burlington. He seemed to be doing well at work. They came for Sunday dinners every couple of weeks. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to look. It was around the second year that things started to shift. Not dramatically. Not in a way you could point to. More like the way a photograph fades. You don't notice it day by day, but then one morning you pick it up and realize the colors aren't what they used to be. Simone stopped calling as much. When I did reach her, she sounded tired in a way that wasn't about sleep. I'd ask how she was doing and she'd say, "Fine, Mum, busy," and then change the subject. Once I asked if she and Conrad were okay, and she went so quiet for so long that I asked if the call had dropped. "We're fine," she said. "He's just under a lot of stress." I didn't push. I should have pushed. But I know how it feels to want to protect the version of your life that you've decided to believe in, and I wasn't going to be the one to puncture that for her. Then, in March of last year, Simone called me on a Tuesday afternoon, which she never did. She called to ask if they could stay with me, just temporarily, she said. Conrad had made some investments that hadn't gone the way he'd planned, and they'd had to pull money out of their savings, and they were 3 months behind on the mortgage. The bank had sent a notice. "Of course," I said, before she even finished the sentence. "I have a 4-bedroom house in Oakville that I've owned outright since 2019. My late mother left me a small inheritance, and I put it toward the mortgage. The house is paid off, the property taxes are current, and I've been careful with my retirement savings since I left the firm at 63. I'm not wealthy, but I'm stable, and I've worked hard to stay that way. I gave them the guest room and the room beside it, which I'd been using as a sewing space. I moved my things to the basement storage. I made it as comfortable as I could. For the first few weeks, it felt good to have the house full again. Simone and I would have tea in the mornings before Conrad woke up. She looked less tired. She laughed more. I told myself this was the right thing, and it was. But Conrad began to change the moment he felt comfortable. It started small. He'd leave dishes in the sink even though I'd asked once, nicely, if we could keep the kitchen clean. He'd use my car without asking and come back with the gas tank lower than before. He'd make comments at dinner. Not mean exactly, but dismissive. I'd say something and he'd kind of smile and look at Simone like they shared a private joke about me. One evening, I heard them talking in the hallway. I wasn't trying to listen. My bedroom door was open. Conrad was saying, in that low, calm voice of his, that I didn't understand how property worked, that the house was essentially sitting there doing nothing, that the equity in it could be working. Simone said something quiet that I couldn't catch. He said, "She's 67, Simone. What does she need all this for?" I lay very still in my bed and I stared at the ceiling. After that, I paid closer attention. I noticed that he'd started asking questions about my finances. Casual questions embedded in normal conversation. What bank did I use? Whether I had an advisor? What my mother's estate had looked like? I answered vaguely and then changed the subject, but I could feel the shape of what he was doing. I've spent 30 years working in a law firm. I've watched enough to know when someone is building toward something. Then one afternoon, I came home from my book club earlier than expected and found him in my home office. He was at my desk. He had my filing cabinet open. He looked up and smiled like it was nothing. Said he was looking for a stapler. "My filing cabinet does not contain staplers." I smiled back and said I thought I'd left the stapler in the kitchen. That night, I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after everyone went to bed. I thought about calling Simone. I thought about confronting Conrad. I thought about asking them to leave. But here's the thing about having a daughter you love. You don't want to blow up her life unless you're certain. You want to be sure. You want to have something you can hold in your hands and say, "Here, this is what I saw. This is what I know." So I decided to be sure. I have a friend named Harriet who retired from the OPP, the Ontario Provincial Police, after 32 years. We met in a yoga class back in 2015, which is not a thing I thought would ever happen to me, and she's been one of my closest friends since. I called her the next morning. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I love most about her. When I finished, she said, "Vivian, trust your gut. I have never in my career seen a woman your age with your instincts be wrong about something like this." She helped me understand what I could do legally. She told me to be careful about what I moved or changed in my home so as not to give any warning. She recommended a solicitor, Sandra, a woman I'd actually crossed paths with years ago at the firm, who specialised in elder financial abuse cases. Sandra told me the same thing: document everything, secure what you can quietly, and be patient. So that's what I did. First, I contacted my bank. I spoke with the branch manager directly and told her I was concerned that someone might attempt to access my accounts or use my information without authorization. She flagged my account for extra verification requirements. Any changes, any large transfers, any new signing authorities, I would be notified by phone call, not just email. I also changed my passwords and set up a new email address that I only accessed from my phone. Then I spoke to my solicitor, Sandra, about my property. I wanted to make sure that my deed, my will, everything was exactly where it needed to be, and that nothing could be altered without multiple layers of verification. She reviewed everything and made a couple of updates I'd been meaning to make anyway. She also told me, very quietly, that forging a property transfer document was not as rare as people thought, and that I was right to be cautious. Then I bought 2 small security cameras. One I placed in the hallway outside my home office, angled at the door. One I placed in the kitchen, pointed at the table where I kept the basket where I stored my mail. Both looked like ordinary smoke detector accessories. I did not tell anyone. I also began making a written log. Every conversation that struck me as off, every time Conrad asked about finances, every time something was moved or touched, I dated each entry. I kept the notebook in my car. 3 weeks in, Conrad found the lock I'd put on my home office door. "What's this about?" he asked at dinner. Simone was right there. His tone was light, curious, but his eyes weren't. "Just keeping things tidy," I said. "I've been meaning to organise in there, and I don't want anyone to have to look at the mess." He smiled. "Sure," he said. But after dinner, I watched him from the hallway. He stood at the office door and he tried the handle, slowly. He stood there for a long moment with his hand on it. I went to bed and I didn't sleep much. Things escalated the following month. I came home one afternoon to find the mail basket had been gone through. Not messily, actually quite neatly, which almost made it worse. Someone had been careful. 2 pieces of my mail had been placed back in a different order. I know because I'd left them in a specific way. I checked the camera footage that evening. Conrad had stood at the kitchen table for nearly 10 minutes, going through each piece of mail. He'd photographed several documents with his phone, including a property tax statement and something from my investment account. I sat in my car in the driveway and I held the phone in my hands for a while. I thought about my daughter. I thought about my daughter. I thought about what she was married to. Then I called Sandra. She said we were close, but she wanted one more piece. Something more direct than mail going through. She said she'd spoken to a colleague at the RCMP who handled financial fraud cases, and that if I could get anything more concrete, an attempted access, an attempt to use my documents, we'd have a much stronger position. I thought about that for 2 days. Then I did something deliberate. I left a folder on the kitchen table. Inside it, I put a piece of paper that looked like a form, the kind you might use to update a beneficiary or a signing authority. I made it look like something I'd filled out partway and left by accident. I printed it from a template I found online, filled in my name and account number, a closed account I no longer use, and left the rest blank. I set it out before I left for my Thursday afternoon walk. I made sure I mentioned at breakfast that I was going out and wouldn't be back for 2 hours. I went for my walk. I came back in 90 minutes. The folder had been opened. The form had been removed and placed back at a slightly different angle. And on the camera footage, clear as anything, I watched Conrad sit down at my kitchen table, open the folder, photograph both pages of the form, and then open his laptop and spend 14 minutes on what appeared to be a search session. I had everything I needed. Sandra made the call to her RCMP contact. I made the call to my bank to let them know what we'd found. We set a date. I asked Harriet if she'd be willing to come with us, not in an official capacity, just to be there. She said she'd already cleared her schedule. The one part that stayed with me was Simone. I hadn't told her any of this. Part of me was protecting her. Part of me, and I'll be honest about this, was afraid that she'd warn him, not out of malice, out of the same instinct that makes women protect the life they've built, even when it's hurting them. I understand that instinct. I felt it myself. But I couldn't take the risk. The morning of, I told Simone I needed to run some errands and that Sandra, my solicitor, was coming by to drop off some papers. This was true. I didn't tell her what else was happening. Conrad was home. He'd told Simone the week before that he was working from home on Tuesdays. What he hadn't told her was that he'd been let go from his position in November. I found out from a search Sandra ran. He hadn't been working at all. I drove around the block twice before I parked. Harriet was already waiting near the front. The RCMP officer, a quiet woman named Constable Okafor, who had the calmest eyes I've ever seen, was parked 2 houses down. Sandra was on the phone when I pulled up. We walked to the front door together. I unlocked it slowly. He was standing at the kitchen table. My filing folder, the real one, the one with actual documents, was open in front of him. He had my property deed in his hands. He turned when he heard us come in. The property deed slipped from his fingers and landed on the floor. I remember Constable Okafor stepped forward and said his name. I remember Conrad opened his mouth and closed it. I remember Harriet put her hand briefly on my arm. And I remember the folder on the floor, my name visible on the deed, and how strange and clarifying it felt to have been right. I won't go through everything that happened legally in the weeks after. There were statements and interviews and documents and a process that moved more slowly than I wanted and faster than Conrad expected. I'll say only that the evidence from the cameras and the photographed documents gave us a very clear picture of intent. Sandra was extraordinary. Constable Okafor was professional and thorough. Conrad hired a lawyer immediately and tried to frame everything as a misunderstanding, but the footage said what it said, Simone found out that afternoon. I sat with her in the kitchen after everyone else had left, and I told her everything, all of it. From the night I'd heard him talking in the hallway to the log I kept in my car. She didn't say anything for a long time. Then she cried. Not the kind of crying that's about being upset with someone, the kind that's about finally letting yourself know something you've been refusing to know. We sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I made tea and she held the cup, and we talked until the light outside went from late afternoon to evening to night. She's been in counselling since. She's made decisions I'll fully support no matter what they turn out to be. What I know is that she came back to herself, slowly, the way people do when they finally stop protecting something that was never worth protecting. I think about the women who don't have a Harriet to call, who don't have 30 years of watching solicitors work, who don't know what to document or how or who to call, or that any of this is even possible. I think about them a lot. If you're reading this and something in your gut is telling you that something isn't right, please listen to it. Not because every instinct is correct, but because your peace of mind and your safety are worth investigating. You do not owe anyone access to what you've built. Not your savings, not your home, not the papers in your filing cabinet, not even in the name of family. I'm 67 years old. I live alone in my paid-off house in Oakville. My daughter calls me on Tuesday afternoons again. The peaches were good this summer. And I have never once regretted trusting myself. I think about the moment Conrad's hands froze over my property deed, and I don't feel angry anymore. I mostly feel tired, the way you feel after carrying something heavy for too long and finally setting it down. What strikes me now, looking back, is how clearly everything followed from the choices each of us made. Not fate, not luck, just choices and the weight they carry. Conrad made a series of choices built on a simple calculation, that I was old enough to be overlooked and trusting enough to be taken from. He was wrong on both counts, but the thing is, his calculation didn't come from nowhere. It came from a habit of seeing people as resources rather than as human beings who had worked and sacrificed and earned the ground they stood on. That habit, that willingness to take from someone who'd done nothing but open her home, is what brought him to my kitchen table with my deed in his hands. And it's what ended everything for him in that same room. I made choices too. I chose to pay attention when something felt wrong, even when I couldn't yet name what it was. I chose to be methodical instead of reactive. I chose to protect what was mine without cruelty, without confrontation for its own sake, and without losing myself in the process. Those choices didn't come easily. There were nights I sat at my kitchen table and wanted to simply ask them to leave, to be done with it. The slower path required something I had to consciously decide to keep reaching for, a kind of clear-headedness that grief and worry make very difficult to hold on to. Simone's choices were the hardest to watch. She chose for a long time to believe in a version of her marriage that was slowly costing her herself. I don't judge her for that. I understand it more than I can say. But what I noticed after everything came out was that the moment she stopped protecting that version and let herself see the truth, she started coming back. The counselling, the conversations, the long evenings at the kitchen table. She brought her own kind of courage to all of it. That doesn't happen without something decent at the centre of a person, something that knows how to find its way back when the conditions finally allow it. What I want to say, if any of this is useful to anyone, is that the three things that got me through were not dramatic or exceptional. They were ordinary and quiet and available to anyone. The first was simply doing what I believed was right, not retaliating, not humiliating, just protecting what mattered and telling the truth. The second was thinking carefully before acting, gathering what I needed, refusing to be rushed into a mistake by my own fear or anger. The third was not giving up when the situation felt impossible, when I lay awake at night unsure whether any of it would work, and kept going anyway. I'm still in my house in Oakville. So mine calls on Tuesday afternoons. This summer the garden did better than it has in years. Some things, if you tend them carefully enough, do come back.